think we shall begin. I'm here at the direction of my commanding officer, General Robert E. Lee, and by the grace of our kind Heavenly Father, on this 24th day of April, 1863. My commanding officer, General Lee, sent me here on a specific mission, and that is to talk about this illegal statehood movement that's currently happening here. And what would I find when I passed by one of your local post offices? But this proclamation by Mr. Abraham Lincoln, I failed to call him president. He is not my president. But a bill was passed in the United States Congress on December 31st, 1862, declaring that a new state of West Virginia would be established from the western counties of Virginia. And it's to become a state June 30th, 1863. My primary goal is to dispute that, the constitutionality and the legality of it. But you might think I'm biased being a Confederate general. But I will use the documentation from their own records to show what a sham of government this was. Since some of you do not know me as well as Miss Bell, I was told by General Lee to give a brief description of who I am and my part in the Civil War thus far. I am Thomas J. Jackson, currently holding the rank of Lieutenant General, subordinate to General Lee. My first Virginia ancestors was John and Elizabeth Cummings Jackson. They both immigrated to the New World and were indentured servants in Maryland. After completing their indentured servitude, they were married and immigrated to Moorefield, Virginia. After a short stay there, they went further west, ending up in what you now know as Upshur County, and they laid out the town plat for the town of Buchanan, Virginia, from their landholdings. John and his eldest two sons, George and Edward, would serve in the Revolutionary War, and upon returning, my grandfather, Colonel Edward, would purchase property on the West Fork River that you now know as Jackson Mills. Colonel Edward had 2 wives and 12 children. Their third child, Jonathan, was my father, and he was a lawyer. He would marry my mother, Miss Julia Beckworth Neal, and they would have 4 children: Elizabeth, Juan, myself, born on January 21st, 1824, and my baby sister, Laura Ann. Tragedy would strike our family in March of 1826 when my eldest sister Elizabeth contracted typhoid fever. Seeing as my mother was heavy with child, my father cared for her diligently until her death on March 26th. Correction, on March 5th. But my father would die of the same disease on March 26th. And my sister Laura Ann would be born on March 27th. My mother would remarry 4 years later, a lawyer several years her senior by the name of Woodson. Unfortunately, my mother would die December the 4th, 1831, from complications of childbirth and her tuberculosis. My half-brother worked with. At that point, Warren, myself, and Laura Ann became orphans. Warren was sent to live with his uncle Isaac Brake and Aunt Polly Jackson Brake. Laura and I would take up residence at Jackson's Mills with our step-grandmother, Elizabeth Jackson. Tragedy once again would find us when she was thrown from her horse 4 years later and would die as a result of her injuries. At the time, the custom said it was improper for only bachelor uncles that remained on the farm to raise 2 young children, and Laura and I was split. Laura was sent to go live with her maternal grandparents, the Neals, at Clarksburg, and I was sent where Warren had gone, and that was with Aunt Polly and Uncle Isaac Brake. Being the second Jackson orphan to be placed in this family, I always had the feeling that Uncle Isaac thought that I was an imposition, and he and I did not get along. So I walked the 22 miles back to Jackson's Mill and asked my Uncle Cummins, who was then proprietor at the mills, to to become his ward. He agreed. My formative years were there. I had very little education, 2 or 3 stints at 3 months normal schools. Most of my education came from borrowing books from neighbors. When I was 16, I followed in my brother's footsteps and taught 1 season in Freeman Creek School. It was near the Jackson Mills. My brother had since died of tuberculosis. When I was 17, I was promoted. I was given a job as constable in Lewis County. But being only 17, Judge Jackson and Uncle Cummins had to post my bond. It was during this time that I would find out of the opportunity for my lifelong dream of gaining a formal education. Congressman Hayes had sent word to the area there in Weston that he would send a man around to give a preliminary examination, as he had to make an appointment to West Point. You can imagine how devastated I was when I found out that I had played second. I had lost out to one Gordon Butcher, Gibson Butcher, the county clerk, who had more education than I. But a few weeks later, Gibson Butcher returned from West Point, said he did not like it. And I was encouraged to seek out letters of introduction to be his replacement. There was 133 of us that was invited to West Point that year. 123 of us showed up to take the formal entrance exam. 111 of us was accepted. I was the 111th, last in my class. 4 years later, the 59 of us who survived graduated, and I graduated 17th out of the class of 59. I was immediately commissioned second lieutenant in the artillery and was sent to the Mexican War. I was promoted 3 times for bravery and efficiency under fire and protection of my kind Heavenly Father. Returned to the States as a brevet major. It was then that Providence was once again shined upon me. Colonel Smith, the superintendent of the Virginia Military Institute at Lexington, Virginia, sent me a letter offering me the position of chair of natural and experimental philosophy, which is the teaching of all sciences that do not come under the discipline of chemistry or biology. I was also encouraged to give instruction in artillery. And it has been said that I was better as an artillery instructor than I was as a science teacher. My life was lovely there. I became familiar with the president of Washington College, which shared the same ridgeline as VMI, Dr. George Junkin, and would eventually marry his second daughter, Eleanor Junkin. We were married August the 4th of 1853. Unfortunately, I would lose my wife and my stillborn son on October 22nd, 1854. I would remarry in 1856 to a dear friend's younger sister, Miss Isabella Hill, the wife of D.H. Hill, who had recommended me to Colonel Smith for the position at VMI. Younger sisters had visited her in Lexington on time before I was married, and I had provided escort for them throughout the town. So I went to visit her father, Dr. Robert Hall Morrison, Presbyterian minister, founder and past president of the Davidson College in North Carolina, and asked if I could seek his daughter's hand in marriage. He approved. We were married on July 16, 1857. We had a lovely life there in Lexington. I became a deacon of the Presbyterian Church, and one of the things I'm most proud of in my life is the establishment of the Black Sunday School class there that continues to grow to this day. The John Brown's raid in '59 stirred up the controversy that we seem to be paying for now. I was ordered to bring the cadets from VMI to Charlestown to serve as security during his execution. That being followed by Mr. Lincoln's campaign for office stirred up the controversy that we find ourselves in the middle of now. I'm now starting to get closer to the reason that I'm here. although I'll do a brief summary of the battles that I've participated in so far. You see, Mr. Lincoln was elected on a platform that the South simply could not withstand. You hear a lot of talk about slavery, but that was not the base issue. That was the issue that was used to disguise the real purpose for the war. You know, I can tell you that General Lee and I, neither one support the slave industry. Yes, we both have servants on our property list. Technically, they can be called slaves. I view those on my list more as extended family. We simply argue that the South, especially the state of Virginia that we're citizens of, should have the right to bring back the end of slavery in a peaceful, legitimate manner in order to transition from one type of economy to the other without either ruining the state's economy or ruining the lives of those that the North supposedly are out to protect. Mr. Charles Dixon was quoted in the English papers, the New York or the London Times, as saying that anyone who does not think that the Civil War in America is not about money is a fool. The real emphasis that came about from Lincoln's election was he and the Republican Party supported what became known as the Morrill Tariff Act. Now I want you to refer back to the 1860s registry. You can go research it yourself. Go look at the Federal Registry in 1860 and see where the revenue from the county for the country came from. If you do your diligent search, you will find that 80% of the federal treasury came from southern farmers. If you further review that, you will find that 70% of the federal treasury was spent on northern industry, either in direct subsidies or the making of canals or railroads. Well, what was the Morrill Tariff Act going to do? It was going to raise the current rate of 18% tariff to an outrageous 47% on the backs of those same southern farmers. Now, this had been tried before in the 1830s. The taxes of abomination came about and raised the tax rate at that time from 15% to 35%. South Carolina was about ready to secede at that time. But General Andrew Jackson, no related, had become president. And within a couple years, he was able to get that scaled back to the present, or at least 18% was present in 1860. There's no way that the South could allow a president to impose a tax such as that. Now, South Carolina and 6 other states seceded. Virginia did not. We wanted to be loyal to the Union. After all, look at Virginia's history. We had more presidents than any other state. The author of the Declaration of Independence was our own Thomas Jefferson, as well as being president. The drafter of the Constitution was a good Virginia man. We were hoping by us staying loyal along with some other border states that we could convince the national government they needed to mediate the dispute with our southern sisters. But then old Mr. Lincoln again, he pulls out some more tricks. I hold before you a textbook that was used at West Point when I was a cadet there. The United States government had commissioned Dr. William Rawls to write a view of the Constitution for us to use as a textbook, so that every military officer coming out of West Point would have a good founding in what the Constitution was about, and understand the relationship between state sovereign and the federal government that had been given limited abilities to act on the common good. And in no other than 3 different places in this textbook, Mr. Rawls explains that succession is constitutional. Everybody had assumed that it was from the beginning of the United States. Virginia had passed a concurrent resolution when adopting the Constitution, stating that very fact, that when its citizens were determined that withdrawing from this union would be more beneficial to the citizens, and they had the right to do so. Rhode Island passed a similar one. Many other states didn't even see the necessity of it, because in the Constitution itself it gave a very narrow framework for the federal government to work in. Only those powers that the state had loaned to the federal government. Mr. Lincoln was the first one to challenge this and said, no, once in, always in. No one before had ever thought of that. Quite frankly, the South was not the first ones to speak of secession. In 1803, when our illustrious President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Purchase, New England states such as Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire was about ready to secede, because then it was unfair that the Charter of Virginia, which listed from the king sea to sea, would be extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean, as well as Tennessee and North Carolina and others. And therefore they said that they could not compete with such states as being so large. Well, what did the southern states do? They saw the dilemma. They agreed that they were in this confederation. They wanted a stronger federal government, but still maintained their sovereign rights, and they gave up the sovereign right that their land grants had given them from sea to sea, and gave the land back to the federal government to use as they saw fit to create new states in the future. So New England decided not to secede. New England would try to secede a second time when the War of 1812 became such that President Jefferson again declared that we would have an embargo of trade with England and France. Well, that trade obviously was more involved in the North, at least they claimed so. It was buying our cotton, our rice. The same people. But it was New England that decided that they would try to secede. Fortunately, the war ended before they completed their actions. I've already mentioned South Carolina mentioned secession in 1835. Nowhere in that whole time did anybody ever question the right of the state to secede. It was common knowledge, it was well known that any state that voluntarily entered a union, giving up limited powers to that federal government, had the right, following the proper steps as outlined by Mr. Rawls, to secede. And what were those steps? Those steps would be basically the same steps that you would use to call a constitutional convention, which the state of Virginia has done often, as well as the United States have done. And that is that you call for a convention. And you hold a referendum at local level for people to elect their local delegates to attend that convention. That convention meets, discusses the issue, and comes to a vote. In the matter of secession, if they vote not to secede, nothing else has to occur. But if that convention votes to secede, then they must throw it back to you, the citizens, to vote whether to approve it or not. That's how it's outlined by Dr. Rawls in this view of the Constitution. We'll get back to this in just a moment. But right now I'll proceed with the chronology of my involvement. The last straw came when Mr. Lincoln committed his second act of war unconstitutionally without consulting Congress. His first act was to blockade southern ports. That is an act of war requiring Congress's consent. He failed to call Congress to ask their consent until 3 months after the war had begun. But his final straw for Virginia was when he called up a national army of 75,000 troops, which 2,340 have been required of Virginia to provide. And that's when Governor Lecter informed him that Virginia would not provide him troops to march through Virginia to go to South Carolina to attack a sovereign state after they had fulfilled their constitutional duties in outlining their secession. Now, Virginia had held a convention on secession prior to Lincoln's call for troops. And they had voted to remain law. Therefore, they didn't have to ask the citizens to approve that, because the citizens had already approved their actions in joining the Union. But upon this letter, that convention reconvened, and they took another vote. And that vote was to secede. We'll pick up on that point in a minute. Well, upon Virginia's secession, my duty was very clear. I found myself to be the ranking officer at VMI. I was first a citizen of Virginia, and because Virginia was part of the Union, I had served the Union in the Mexican War. Once Virginia withdrew from the Union, I no longer had any part in the United States. I was a citizen of my sovereign state of Virginia, and to her I owed my allegiance. I was soon summoned to bring the cadets to Richmond to act as drill instructors. Then I was promoted to colonel and placed at Harper's Ferry to organize the volunteers and the militia there. 3 weeks later, we were accepted into the Confederacy, and I into the Confederate Army. And Joseph Johnson was given command of our area. General Johnson promoted me to brigadier general and gave me 1st Brigade, which you've come to know as the Stonewall Brigade. Our first actions was at Manassas. My duty was to hold my troops into reserve on the reserve side of Henry House Hill. And there my troops would learn why I drilled them so hard. It was then that my good friend, General Gordon B., that I had served with not only in the Mexican War, but we had been students together at West Point, rode up to me and said, "General, they are driving us." We were being routed from the field. And I said, "General, then we shall give them the bayonet." That gallant general rode off to the oblique to rally his troops, and in so doing he drew his sword and pointed to my men and said, "Look there at Jackson's men. They're standing like a stone wall. Let us resolve to die here this day, and we will be victorious." Unfortunately, that gallant general died on the field of battle that day, and you cannot attest that his statement was about my men, not about me. Well, following the battle at Manassas, I was promoted to Major General and given the Shenandoah Valley. I've recently submitted a war report that between March 22nd and June 9th, my ill-equipped 17,000 men had marched over 670 miles, won 5 of 6 major battles, defeated 3 separate Union armies, captured 900 small arms, 20 pieces of artillery, and tons of military stores. Shortly after the Valley campaign, I was summoned by General Lee to come to Richmond to help repel McClellan from the peninsula. While we were there, the fractured armies that I had left behind for the Union were pieced back together and put under the command of General Pope, with the instructions to come hit us in the rear while we were dealing with McClellan. General Lee gave me A.P. Hill and the rest of my division and sent us north to block his advance. We did so at Cedar Mountain. General Lee and Longstreet, after having gotten the rest of McClellan off the peninsula, came north to Gordonsville. And there was a plan developed that we needed to get in the back of Pope's army to prevent McClellan from coming back up the Potomac and joining with him, and therefore providing overwhelming numbers that we would not have been able to handle. I was given a mission to get around in his rear to cut off his lines of supply and communication. We did so. And then we took up position at the old Union lines of the Manassas battlefield. I put my men in an abandoned railroad cut. It actually was a railroad cut that had not been finished. The tracks had not been laid, but the ballast was there. And there for 3 days I withstood the full onslaught of Pope's army until Lee and Longstreet could come through Thurfell Gap and roll up their flank. It would be at this time that General Lee thought it was appropriate to invade the North. We had several objectives. One, get the Union Army out of northern Virginia so our farmers could harvest their crops. 2 was hopefully to liberate Maryland I've got to stop here on a sidetrack to tell you a little bit about Lincoln here again. Lincoln had no regard for the Constitution. Why would we need to liberate Maryland? Well, he had declared martial law there and locked up the state's legislature to prevent them from even discussing the issue of secession. Duly elected representatives of the state of Maryland were arrested, sent off to Fort Lafayette in New York as political prisoners to keep them from exercising their duly elected rights and responsibilities to the citizens of Maryland. Does that sound to you like a man that's upholding the Constitution he swore to uphold? Well, that was one of our objectives. Another objective was that we severely needed the help of England and France. We was hoping that they would come in and recognize the South based upon their trade with us that had been interrupted because of the northern blockade. But I guess that they were waiting to see whether we were sufficiently strong enough to be worthy of their recognition. Well, after the defeat of three armies in the Shenandoah Valley, the repulsing of McClellan, the defeat of Pope's army, General Lee felt that if we had one more major victory up on northern soil, that it would be emphasis for England and France to recognize us and to help provide us with a navy that we really did not have. The fourth objective, now these are all strategic or political. I'll get into the tactical objective in a minute. The fourth objective, it was nearing the midterm elections of '62. And President Lincoln's war coalition was pretty fragile. They called them copperheads up north, but they were peace Democrats that wanted to allow us to go and live in peace and have two nations that could cooperate each other but could go their separate ways. If they gained enough seats in the midterm election, Lincoln would have had to sue for peace. They would have been forced to. And so we thought if we brought the war north to northern citizens, for them to experience the degradations that only southern citizens had experienced, that this might give emphasis to the peace Democrats in the north. Our tactical objective was to reach Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania, which was a large railroad depot and central storage area for all the supplies that were coming south to us. But to be able to do that, we had to clear out the Union troops that had reoccupied Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And I was given that task. I was given 3/4 of Lee's troops, and we did a 70-mile end around. Captured the largest army in American history on September 15th at Harper's Ferry. 13,000 men, 13,000 small arms, 73 pieces of artillery, 200 wagons, 1,200 mules, and tons of military supplies, to include medical supplies that we desperately needed. But McClellan had found a lost copy of General Order 191 that General Lee had issued to set us about, and he was hard on General Lee in Longstreet's Hills up at South Mountain. On September 16th, I reunited my troops with General Lee at Sharpsburg, Maryland, on the west bank of the Antietam. And I agreed with General Lee that he held good high ground. And there on the 17th of September, the bloodiest battle in American history took place. 23,000 people fell that day. 10,000 of them were Confederates. 13,000 were Union. General Lee said, look, we have been discovered. Therefore, it would not be wise for us to try to go on further to Harrisonburg. Let us withdraw back into the Shenandoah Valley, refit, reorganize, and come north again when they are not expecting it. We waited there on the 18th for McClellan to give battle, but he wanted no more Bobby Lee. So on the night of the 18th, we withdraw into the Shenandoah Valley. If we'd have known what Mr. Lincoln was going to do 5 days later, I dare say we would have held our ground. You see, 5 days later, Mr. Lincoln declares that Antietam was a victory for the Union. Now let's recount the numbers. September 15th to September 17th is all to me one action. He had lost 26,000 people. And 13,000 of that was totally wiped out all the cannon and everything. We had lost 10,000. But you see, General Lee needed a victory to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, the Northern press, why, they're falling all over themselves, calling him the great emancipator. That is the press that was left. You see, Lincoln could disguise that he had actually been defeated over those 3 days because he had ruined all the presses in the North that was in opposition. He had burnt or destroyed over 200 Northern newspapers. And what was their sole crime? Disagreeing with his war policies. What happened to freedom of the press? What happened to the First Amendment? So those touty newspapers that only supported Lincoln was all that was left, and they said it was a great victory. Well, now let's look at this Emancipation Proclamation and see what it was really worth. It was to free only slaves in those states in rebellion if they were still in rebellion in January. He didn't control any of those states. So who did he free? Nobody. Did he free the slaves that was under his control in Delaware? No. Kentucky? No. Missouri? No. He had now occupied most of New Orleans and the territory around it. Did he free those slaves? No. In fact, when General Fremont had freed those slaves, Lincoln countermanded his order and returned them to their masters. Great emancipator. So what was the purpose of his Emancipation Proclamation? He said it himself. It was a war measure. He was hoping that servile insurrection would occur back on the home and farms and the plantations, that the Negro would arise and attack the masters, and the troops would have to come off the front lines and go back to prevent carnage. Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. And rather than you think that I'm biased, since I have admitted that there are servants on my property rolls that could be considered slaves, I'll let a French essayer by the name of Tocqueville, who traveled through the United States in the 1830s. And he wrote essays explaining that race relations in the North were much more better than those in the South. That those in the South would be more of what you would call familiar, family-like. Get back to the war, I was promoted to my current rank of Lieutenant General. Once again was in the Shenandoah Valley. But along last November, I was called down to Fredericksburg to join Robert E. Lee against the new general, General Burnside. And joined the Battle of Fredericksburg that lasted from December 11th to December 15th. The Union lost 12,600 people to our 4,003. During the winter, it became apparent to us of this illegal government called the Restored Government of Virginia that was operating out of Wheeling in their movement to create a new state that they're calling West Virginia. General Lee thought that it would be best that if he sent out some of his subordinates to come into our area to talk to our good citizens so that you were fully aware of what was going on and to tell you not to fall for the ruse. Now, I'm a field general. I'm not much into politics and statistics. So General Lee's headquarters and staff, along with my staff, put together this poster board for me and about this illegal statehood movement. I hope that you permit me to read a few passages to you. First of all, I'd like to explain what's on this board. I know it's in such small print that you're not going to be able to read it from there, but I'll be quoting from this board from my notes here. What first the staff put here is a timeline of actions in West Virginia, in Virginia. The next is a northern newspaper article describing this statehood referendum, just this past April, just a few weeks ago, on this new state's constitution. Well, these new people, actually the Northern Republican industrialists that are trying to push this statehood movement, are making a big deal that the western counties of Virginia had always sought to separate themselves from Virginia. Through this progression, we do find in 1829 that there was a controversy of eastern and western sections of Virginia spread up during the Constitutional Convention. At that time, delegates from the western counties had gone to Richmond and argued that they were not being fairly treated. And the truth be known that the planters in the East controlled government. They picked the state legislatures, and the state legislatures picked the governor. And representation was not very fair, not only for Western citizens, but also for those yeomanry and unlanded citizens in Virginia. They couldn't vote. And so upon the closure of that Constitutional Convention, the Wheeling Gazette proposed separation of Western Virginia from Eastern Virginia. So in that sense, they were correct. At one time, Western counties were clamoring for a separation. But that all changed over the next 20 years. One of the interesting things that happened in 1836, the B&O Railroad reaches Harper's Ferry. And so more and more settlers were coming into the western counties, not just because of the B&O, but the B&O was because of that, or a part of that. The convention was called, and by this time, the citizens of western counties were heard, and the Constitutional Convention changed the Constitution to make things equal. What proof do I have of that? Well, if we look in the election of 1851, Joseph Johnson of Bridgeport became the first governor of Virginia from western counties. And the western delegates outnumbered the eastern delegates in the legislature. During the decade of 1850 to 1860, great investments in our roads, such as the Parkersburg Turnpike and others, was being made. We had reached parity with our eastern sisters and brothers, and things were looking up until John Brown's invasion. That brings us back now to that second vote on secession, when our delegates voted to secede on April 17, 1861, from the Union. I want you to take a look at this map that accompanied this article describing the proposed state of West Virginia. And you'll see that it is broken up into three different shades of color. Yellow to the north, blue in the center, and gray to the south. We'll get more to that distinction. But right now, I want to concentrate on the yellow section here to the north. They were heavily influenced by northern industry and northern money. And these northern industrialists had gotten themselves elected as local delegates to the convention. Well, upon the overwhelming vote in the convention to secede, these delegates from these 16 counties went scrambling back home and had a meeting. That meeting occurred on May 13th to May 15th. And already they were plotting to create a new state. Now, what was wrong with that? Remember the three steps I said that Rawls lined out for secession. Well, the convention had only voted to recommend secession to the citizens. The vote by the citizens had not been cast yet. And they're already planning a new state. Well, somebody came to their senses and said, wait a minute, we better wait and see what the citizens have to say. Well, the citizens overwhelmingly supported secession. Over 85% of the voters from Virginia voted in favor of secession. So they would meet again in what is now known as the Second Wheeling Convention in 1861 between June 11th and the 25th. And they created what we now call the false government, or the restored government of Virginia, declaring themselves to be the true government, law to the Union. But again, it was only a pretext to get around the United States Constitution. See, there's a little minor detail in the United States Constitution that says if a state's going to be formed from within the boundaries of an original state, the original state has to give its permission. That's the reason they had to form the restored government of Virginia, so they could give themselves permission to create their own state. You know, Sometimes people are blind, but we're not ignorant. One only has to look at the public record to see the party and business affiliations. Check out Carlisle. Check out Willie. Check out Pierpont. Follow the money. You'll see that they're heavily invested in the B&O Railroad, the coal industry, the iron industry, and the burgeoning starting of the oil industry. They're all wrapped up in it. This so-called restored government of Virginia rushed to hold a referendum on the question of forming a new state on October 24th, 1861, before they ever asked to become part of the Union. They weren't recognized as part of the Union until May 13th, 1862. Again, they're putting the cart before the horse. They keep leading with this idea of creating the new state. They claimed that this state that they had the gall to call West Virginia had overwhelming support from the voters of the state that they proposed. Well, let's look at their own documentation. First of all, let's look at this petition when they first said, let's have the referendum. In this article here, their own lieutenant governor. This is their own lieutenant governor, Daniel Posey, was recorded during the Second Whig Convention as asking the question, where's the proof that an overwhelming clamor for action for a new state exists? He was given 3 petitions containing 700 names. He was not impressed. When you look at the outline of the boundaries proposed to be this new state, 65,000 registered voters were on the rolls in 1860, and only 700 of them was wanting a new state. Let's look at the results of this so-called referendum on statehood that was held on October 24, 1864, in the recorded minutes of the restored government of Virginia. This is a quote right here, if you want to come over and take a look at it after the presentation. Secretary of the Commonwealth, L.A. Hagan, starts by saying, the returns from many of the counties reached this office in a confused state. But we believe them to be correct. Does that sound like political double talk to you? How is anything in the state of confusion have the gall to be called correct? But let's assume for a moment that they were correct, which is a very large assumption. I'll address that later. When looking at their own results, only 1/3 of the state supported the new state. 1/3 was forced to participate solely because it was occupied by the Union Army. And the last third did not vote at all because they did not recognize an illegitimate government nor want to participate in an illegitimate election. And again, if you look at those thirds here on this map, if you look at the support, the yellow part, that was the support for the area of the county or the state that did support a new state. Those 16 counties were all north of or contingent to the B&O Railroad. Or they were in a triangle between the Monongahela River and the Ohio River. This area for a long time had been greatly influenced by northern industry and northern wealth and investment. Out of 65,000 voters on the rolls, only 17,000 voted in this election. And 70% of the approval came from those 16 counties. If we go down to the third, or the next third of the state you see in blue there, the only reason the election was held at all was because the Union armies forced the polls to be opened. And only 14% of the population voted in those counties. So I'm here to tell you that this new state is being created by only 16 states, very heavily influenced by Lincoln's Northern Republicans. Well, let's look at the assumption of correctness now. We let that go for a while. We said if everything's correct, you can see it's still only 16 counties was creating the state. But now let's take a look at this 70% vote in those 16 counties and see how accurate it was. And again, not Confederate speaking here. I'm going to quote the people in that election, in that restored government. Delegate Chapman J. Stewart said in this very meeting where they recalled these, now, Mr. President, to show you, and it needs but to be looked at the figures to satisfy the mind of every member, that even a majority of the people have never come to the polls and expressed their sentiments in favor of the new state. 17,000 people voted compared out of 65,000 registered voters. Then he goes on to say, and even in some of them, the votes came from the Army. Now, I've got a lot of Virginia troops in my unit. The majority of the Stonewall Brigade are from Virginia. And if the state of Virginia was to hold an election and they were not in their county to vote, I see no reason why they could not file their votes in our camps and we could forward them. But I do object to a high Union soldiers voting in Hampshire County for a new state just because they're stationed there. And that's what happened right here in your county. That's what Mr. Stewart was referring to. It was common knowledge that Union soldiers of a higher regiment had voted in Hampshire County. And if we come up here and look at the Hampshire County vote, we will find that 195 votes were in the affirmative for a new state. That doesn't surprise me, seeing how the Union Ohio soldiers voted. What surprised me is the 18 brave souls that stood forward and said, no, there should not be a new state. Can you imagine the guts it took for them to pass by the crossed bayonets at the poll house doors and vote in the negative? I wish those people were part of my army. That's the people I need to have. Well, let's go on. John Alexander Williams called the vote in Kanawha County an absurdly large and was seriously atypical of the surrounding counties. Kanawha County had changed hands about 3 months before the election. And guess who was stationed in Kanawha County? Another large regiment of General Cox's Ohio troops. I've also been informed that although I have not had time to verify it, that there were more votes cast in Wood County, that's Parkersburg, where the B&O Railroad terminus is, that there were more votes cast there than there were registered voters. This was the headquarters of General Cox and his Ohio regiments. Judge Joseph Applegate of Wellsburg, that's the next major city north of Wheeling, where the convention was taking place, wrote this to Governor Capon. I resign my commission that I received of you to swear in the officers of the county of Brooke on the accounts of the reasons I've already forwarded to you. And those reasons were the blatantly false reporting of votes for statehood from his county of Brooke. Now, while I do not agree with the man's politics being a Union supporter, I do admire the man's honesty and gallantry. That he resigned his office as judge and refused to swear the officers in because he knew that the reporting of these vote totals was blatantly false. John G. Jacob, the owner of the editor of the Wellsburg Herald, said in an editorial that he believed the delegates of the Wheeling Convention were more interested in the state offices for themselves than in the welfare of Western Virginia. Follow the money. They were in it for their own pockets. Well, what about this lower third? You see, the Union Army was not in these counties. They chose not to participate, so they didn't vote at all. They saw it as an illegal election. If one takes a look at the vote totals over here, again smuggled out from the restored government's archives, you will find that the vote totals are almost identical, except in those 2 or 3 counties that had been exchanged from the time of the vote between October and April. There were 1 or 2 counties that we had regained military control of, and 1 or 2 counties that the Union had gained military control of. and you'll see a complete reversal in their vote. The reversal for the Confederates that we controlled. People didn't hold an election, but they were forced in those counties that the Union took over to have an election. And all of a sudden, you see a great difference. Overwhelming support for a new state. What a sham of government. But these local robber barons could not have been successful in this charade had it not been for the support of Mr. Lincoln's government and its total disregard for the Constitution that I've already made clear. I have a newspaper, flipping from one of those northern newspapers, that's entitled, "Distressed Lincoln Signs Statehood Bill." I admit it would be stressful when you fully ignore the Constitution that he swore to uphold. Again, let's let his own cabinet speak, not a Confederate general. His own Attorney General, Edward Bates, this is the chief law officer of the nation. This is the top lawyer of the nation. He stated, "I give it as my opinion that the bill in question is unconstitutional and also by its own intrinsic demerits highly inexpedient. And I persuade myself that Congress, upon mature thought, would be glad to be relieved by a veto from the evil consequences of such an improvident legislation." The Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, concurred and stated the requirements of the Constitution are not complied with, as they in good faith should be. Postmaster Montgomery Blair, one of the top advisors to Lincoln, concurred with these statements. But Mr. Lincoln chose to go ahead with this blatantly unconstitutional act. No surprise to me there. But there were those members of his cabinet that supported him. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said he thought it'd be all right. After all, he wanted a state that surrounded it being no railroad so that he could secure it to move his men back and forth along with supplies. Also supporting the bill was Samuel P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, who was wholeheartedly supportive of Northern industry and interest. Remember, follow the money. Besides, remember I was talking to you about the midterm election? Lincoln was losing popularity, and he was up for re-election in '64. Well, if the Republicans can create a new state, 3 new electoral votes would be in Lincoln's pocket. He wouldn't even have to fight for them. Lincoln's answer to the criticism for allowing West Virginia secession from Virginia, his response was, "It is said that the admission of West Virginia is secession, and tolerated only because it is our secession." Well, if it could be called by that name, there's still difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. It is my sincere hope as a Christian man that Mr. Lincoln's lack of knowledge of the Constitution comes from never having read it. I state this because, as I've previously stated, up until Lincoln's ascendancy to president, the right for a state to secede had not been questioned. Mr. Lincoln simply uses and abuses that precious document whenever it suits his dictatorial nature. Now, I know that you are good citizens of Virginia, or you wouldn't be sitting in front of me and listening to me yap on. But I do believe that not all of your local papers have carried all the facts about this statehood movement that's been going on. That concludes my formal presentation, but I'm willing to take questions if you have any.